Jaroslav Havlíček was a Czech writer known for his psychological prose. Born in 1896 in Jilemnice, the son of teacher Josef Havlíček and his wife Julia Kniová. He attended the gymnasium at Jičín, graduating in 1909, and took a one-year course at the Business Academy in Chrudim before going on to study at the Czech Technical University in Prague. He was conscripted into the army in 1915, being sent to a school for officers, and was wounded several times during the remainder of World War I. He resumed his university studies after the war, while also engaged for a year as an official at the Trade Bank in Prague. In 1921 he married Maria Krauseová, whom he had met several years prior, who began seeing him again in 1920, despite her being engaged at the time. Their son Zbigniew was born in 1922, before the family moved to Krč. Havlíček's daughter Eva was born in 1924. He died in Prague in 1943 due to meningitis. Havlíček initially published poetry, his first verse appearing in print in 1924, and published his prose from around 1928 in such magazines as Cesta or Lumír. His first novel came out in 1935. The collection The Doom of the City of Olšina was first published posthumously in 1944. The first story, The Wall Devil, is the story of young Pleban, a despised young farmer, nicknamed the Student by his neighbours, being harassed and bullied by the entire rest of his small town, primarily at old Segert's pub. Segert has a further reason to mock and belittle Pleban, as the youth was courting the gypsy girl Marta that Segert was also interested in, but Segert managed to win her for himself, which makes him feel very superior about it. Marta is still very fidgety, however, and she seems afraid that someone will come and force her to leave against her will, but she won't say who. Some time later, a shabbily dressed stranger comes to town, and after spending some time at Pleban's farm, he enters the local pub and calls himself a literal devil. The assembled farmers refuse to believe him at first, but he proceeds to list off all of their secret desires, and promises to give to every man what he desires most. This leads to the lot of them parading outside and genuflecting in front of a huge shadow on a nearby wall, only for it to turn out to have been painted by the student who facilitated the shabbily dressed strangers taking Martha into a wagon and driving off with her for good, while the rest of the farmers were wallowing in the dirt, offering their souls to a painted wall. Poor Devil is the story of a greedy butcher and landlord who is suddenly taken ill and is besieged by all his relatives in hopes of being remembered in his will. At the same time, his old servant conspires with their poor neighbour, who keeps coming into the butcher's room every night dressed as a devil, attempting to get money off of him for his family, until he gets caught and beaten by the butcher's nephew. But the revelation ends up giving the landlord such a laugh, he dies of a stroke instantly. The fortune teller concerns a group of friends who meet at the house of former gendarme Tulka in order to listen to a fortune teller he has occasionally come over. But one of the guests doesn't like what she tells him about what she sees at his house, and he then intentionally belittles her poetry and leaves her almost in tears as she goes home, and then the story just ends. The dog concerns Je Bevořech, an elderly accountant who follows a young office worker working at the same office, who keeps sneaking out during work hours to meet with her boyfriend. When she gets caught, he overhears an insult directed his way that calls him an old dog, in reference to his name, and this is the onset of a lengthy psychological delusion of him believing he is actually a dog in human disguise, and this delusion persists until he dies a few days later, never having regained his sanity. Mr. Balaban's pocket watch is the story of Mr. Balaban, a middle-aged businessman from the town of Klinice. A newly arrived watchmaker becomes his tenant and sets up shop in the city, but is bad-mouthed by the locals, who refuse to buy from him and only get supplies on credit because the local businessmen want a share of his stock once he goes bust. In the year 1890, Mr. Balaban, aged 40, takes pity on the watchmaker and sends him an old busted pocket watch to fix, but soon after the man is found hanged in his shop. Mr. Balaban gets the watch back, but finds that it now only goes backwards. A week after the funeral, the ghost of the watchmaker appears to Mr. Balaban, cacklingly warning him to make sure to always keep the watch wound up, or else. And soon after, Mr. Balaban finds he is in fact aging in reverse. Things go well enough for him at first, until he is forced to give his watch to an old vagrant to wind it for him, as, being now 4 years old, he couldn't possibly do it any more. Finally, the townspeople discover the grave of his mother disturbed, with a hole burrowed into the dirt containing a discarded fetus. The doom of the city of Olšina, the final story and title novella, concerns the small town of Olšina. The story begins with an old pensioner being woken up by an angel weeping at his bedside and telling him that God is dead. During the following days, the inhabitants of the town are treated to many fantastical sights, from the devil coming in for sermon at church, to the local dead rising from their graves in order to knock out every single window in town, a literal poor devil getting the tar beaten out of him when his promised magic tricks do not amuse the local pub-goers, and finally the city ends up being covered by an absolute deluge of angel feathers falling from the sky, which are then blown away, leaving absolutely nothing behind. The latter two stories are easily the best, showing off the cynical nature of Havlíček's writing quite prominently, the title story reminding me very much of Ramus's The Reign of the Evil One. Sadly, I am fairly certain that these stories were never translated into a foreign language.